Is everyone ready? We negate and observe the primary interest of any nation is to protect the lives of its citizens. Contention 1 is troop deaths. Former CIA Deputy Director Michael Morrow finds that an effective retaliation against the Islamic State would require 100,000 boots on the ground. Unfortunately, a repeat of mass deployment will bring a repeat of mass death. As RT News laments, Americans will inevitably have to die on the battlefield if we want to destroy ISIS. According to the Iraqi coalition casualty count, 4,500 Americans died in our last Iraqi ground war. Attacking ISIS with ground combat troops would inflict even more troop casualties than last time for two separate reasons. First is a longer conflict. Stephen Biddle of George Washington University writes that we can reasonably expect a ground war to last 10 years, much longer than we spent fighting in the previous insurgency. And second, more intense conflict. Brett McGurk of the US State Department writes that ISIS is better equipped, better manned, better resourced, better fighters, and better trained than Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which our forces faced last time. It is a globally expansionist, globally jihadist organization. It is swollen with foreign fighters and suicide bombers who will go wherever the organization tells them to go. As a result, the number of troop casualties will be devastating. Fighting terrorism simply isn't worth this massive loss of life. Foreign Affairs writes that in the post-9/11 era, the United States has built up an extensive infrastructure of counterterrorism intelligence, which has helped make terrorist attacks on U.S. soil exceedingly rare. The University of North Carolina quantifies that in the 14 years after 9/11, Muslim-linked extremism and terrorism has claimed the lives of only 37 Americans. Even if fighting ISIL were to somehow eliminate all Islamic extremism in the world, it would only save at most 3 lives a year. Ultimately, committing combat ground troops cannot possibly save more lives than would kill. Contention 2 is the political problem. According to the Foreign Policy Journal, the root causes of ISIL insurgency come from disenfranchisement by the Iraqi government. In the absence of freedom, Iraqis lack legitimate outlets to express their political grievances, making them more likely to resort to political violence and terrorism. Because the problem is political, the Foreign Policy Journal furthers that in the long term, the war against ISIL cannot be won with military action. In fact, military action against ISIL exacerbates the political problem for 2 separate reasons. First is the Hydra effect. According to Vox, non-ISIS terrorist groups have deeper roots in local towns and cities. Given their more resonant ideology, these other groups might be able to mount a more powerful and deadlier insurgency. Just like ISIS emerged from the ashes of AQI, so will other terrorist groups emerge from ISIS if we defeat it. Second is propping up the Iraqi government. The New York Times writes that if we get militarily involved now, our actions could undermine a more inclusive political power-sharing agreement from emerging down the road in Iraq. Al Jazeera explains that foreign military assistance has contributed to the Iraqi Prime Minister's rigidity. The more U.S. support, the more he feels he can refuse to compromise politically in order to stop the current insurgency. This only worsens the cause of the current conflict. Contention 3 is anti-American terrorism. According to Eric Neumeyer of the London School of Economics, U.S. citizens only become victims of international terrorism because of Americans' engagement on the world scene. He explains that an important cause of anti-American terrorism is U.S. military support to foreign countries whose governments are in direct conflict with terrorist groups. Thomas Plumper of the University of Essex corroborates, writing that terror groups ultimately strive for political influence in their home country, and the greater American military support to that country, the more America represents a threat to this terrorist goal. Because according to Neumeyer, U.S. troops actively engage in counter-terrorist actions, and even when they don't directly, they help the government by performing some other necessary military duties for the country. This is problematic because Plumper finds when America makes it less likely for a terror group to achieve its goals, an attack on American citizens maximizes the strategic value of the terror group. By directly targeting America, the terrorist leaders hope to trigger American withdrawal from the region, because they believe that attacking American civilians will ultimately induce the USA to withdraw from the Middle East, and that this would enable them to expand their political influence. For example, Osama bin Laden has repeatedly professed his conviction that the USA are cowards who will give in if only hit hard and long enough. This increased incentive to attack Americans means that committing American troops creates more American civilian deaths back home from terrorism, even if the mission is successful at reducing terrorism. Eric Neumeyer quantifies that a 1 standard deviation increase in U.S. troop presence raises anti-American terrorism specifically by 30%. For these reasons, we urge negation.
Please see a couple cards. You can see the Essex cards, the UNC, US Americans.
Wait, I'm sorry, one at a time, the UNC?
Right, UNC, Essex card, rated at the bottom of your page. And then last but not least, the alternate power sharing, less compromise.
What do you want to see in Neumeyer?
No, not Neumeyer, Essex.
Oh.
Okay, so the last card, they maximize their value.
Okay,
Yeah.
Also, can you see the 100,000 card?
Okay.
At the top.
Troops, yeah. Top
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so. Yeah. Okay. Wait, what's Essex back? It's Neumeyer.
It's Neumeyer, okay.
Okay. Guys.
want, or here, I'll show you where they are on the card and you can navigate between them, right? It's 14, 5, and 10. Is it clear?
Yeah.
So, all right, sure. So in 10, you want this line, right?
Side by side, if you don't mind, so I can like access it quickly.
And sure, I mean, they're equally fast. It's just. Yeah, so. I mean, it's hard when I do it side by side. You can't find it.
Fair enough.
So, this is the line that you want here,
Uh-huh.
right? Your partner didn't ask for a line for the other two studies, so those are just the other two.
Can you show us the part where you read the compromise part? Compromise from, let me just like contention.
So you wanted middle one?
I wanted Biddle compromise, right? That was the one I asked for. I wanted Essex, the one of maximizing gain, and the $100 troops.
All right, so here's, all right.
You want to see the case, you can just give this to you.
Probably the cards, sorry, yeah.
Show off the code.
100,000 troops. You have Morel, 100,000 troops was on your computer. Oh, yeah. Here's,
All right, so here's the photo here.
here's the 100,000. And then here are the other two. Let me get them side by side. Yeah. Okay. So, if I'm missing anything, like, you can ask me again, but
Sure.
here's what I got that you wanted,
Cool.
right? 100,000 heavily armed troops, terrorist lives killed, right? New.
Cool. Thank you.
If there's any way I could get that back as soon as possible,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
have locks on the computer.
Yeah, I'll try my best, yeah.
So,
Alright, you guys ready?
Yeah.
All three judges. We affirm committing United States ground combat troops to fight ISIL will be in the best interest of the United States. Contention 1, all gold everything. Subpoint A, black gold. ISIS threatens the United States oil security in two ways. First, according to the Daily Sabah, ISIS militants captured Iraq's largest oil refinery, which holds about 17% of Iraq's entire oil reserves, seized Syria's largest oil field, Al Omar, and lowered Libya's oil production to about 25% of normal levels. Second, Foreign Affairs explains that just the political turmoil and security concerns are a growing impediment to the supply growth, if not a cause of outright disruption. This is incredibly problematic as the International Energy Agency projects that Iraq's output will account for 60% of all OPEC production growth over the rest of the decade, but the current dynamics suggest that the flood may be just a trickle. Already as a result of an attack on a Mosul refinery, U.S. oil prices spiked by 11%. The impact is twofold. First, Christy Angman of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis finds that even a moderate oil shock increases the probability of a U.S. recession by 60%. Second, Johnson finds that even a moderate disruption of 1 million barrels per day could shave 1% off of U.S. GDP. Subpoint B, regional instability. First, contagion. Kimberly Kagan of the American Enterprise Institute explains that beyond just creating a failed state in Iraq and Syria, ISIL is bringing Lebanon and Jordan to the brink of collapse, eroding state borders and structures in the Sahel and North Africa, and creating a safe haven for terrorism in Yemen. Second, blue gold. Matthew Machowski of Queen Mary University of London explains that ISIS is targeting water installations to cut off supplies to the largely Shia south of Iraq. In fact, Deborah McKenzie of the New Scientist explains that ISIS now controls several major dams on the Euphrates River systems, including Haditha and Samara. Even more, a 2011 report from Water Power magazine finds that an estimated water dam failure could lead to as many as 500,000 civilian deaths. Machowski concludes that its failure to respond to the ongoing water will lead to crisis beyond repair. Ultimately, James Piazza of the University of North Carolina finds that weakened states increase terrorism 15-fold, increasing terrorism to such an unprecedented level that it would pose a direct threat to U.S. national security. Contention 2, military solves. U.S. ground troops could effectively combat ISIS in two ways. First, conventional. Douglas Olivan of the New America Foundation explains that ISIS no longer exists in small cells that can be neutralized by missiles or small groups of commandos. Michael Eichenstadt of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy writes that ISIS has transformed itself from an underground insurgent network to an army with a state that now dominates large swaths of Syria and Iraq. Fortunately, this creates vulnerabilities, as conventional U.S. military forces are the most effective at fighting conventional fighting structures. Ultimately, Patricia Sullivan of the University of Georgia finds that ground troops increase the probability of success for the intervener by 17% in a conventional conflict. Second, Sunni awakening. U.S. ground troops will be able to turn the Sunni tribes that ISIS relies on against it. Roger Zakim of George Mason University explains that Sunni tribes despise ISIL rule, but fear prevents them from taking any action without external support. However, in 2006, U.S. support instigated a Sunni awakening where 90,000 Sunni Arabs joined forces with Iraqi and U.S. forces to combat al-Qaeda. Derek Harvey of the University of South Florida explained as a result that the U.S. military developed extensive relationships with these Sunni tribes that should now be dusted off. Sending in U.S. ground combat troops would provide Sunni tribes with support it needs to fight back. The impact is twofold. First, decimation. James Kelly of Claremont McKenna College finds that an internal Sunni Arab rebellion decreases insurgent forces by 70%. Second, violence reduction. Stephen Biddle of the Council on Foreign Relations finds that the Sunni awakening reduced overall violence in Iraq by 250%. Third, long-term stability. Kimberly Kagan of the Institute for the Study of War explains that the U.S. can leverage increased military support to shape the emerging Iraqi government to be more inclusive and as non-sectarian as possible. As such, sending in ground troops is the only way to ensure that the Sunni people never turn to an organization like ISIS again out of oppression. For all these reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Can I see the Kagan evidence? Sure. I see the oil spikes by 11%. Could I also have my computer back?
Yes. Yeah.
Footnote 3 is 11% hard case. That's the one.
Wait, this is Kagan.
That's Kagan.
What do I want?
All right, so here,
Footnote 11 is 11%.
11% right there.
Footnote 11?
The number 3, 11%.
Where's the card?
Okay, so this is the entire card.
Okay, I'll look at this.
And this is this card?
Sure, that's fine. And that's Kagan. Yeah.
Okay, what do I take prep right now?
Yeah. We don't prep time.
Can you be quiet?
Whenever you're ready.
Everyone's ready? Okay. If we commit combat ground troops, how many lives would we save? How many American lives would we save?
I don't know, but the important thing
You
to
don't know
recognize
how
right
many
the time.
American
Okay,
lives.
so let's actually talk about framework. This is pretty important. I
Okay.
mean, isn't the United States' primary objective to ensure the well-being of its citizens?
Yeah.
And is the well-being of your citizens defined solely by whether they're alive or not?
It's not defined solely by whether you're
Right.
alive
So
or
shouldn't
not.
everything,
But
including economic costs, including instability in
okay,
other
so this is the
regions-
problem, right? So like, when you're evaluating what's an impact to a person's life or what's an impact to a citizen's life, I would say lives are a lot more important than like maybe a minor economic gain.
I mean, what's the warrant for that? I mean, at the point where
What's the warrant for that? The fact that it's a prerequisite to any sort of enjoyment of economic gains.
First of all, like your economic status directly impacts to whether or not you have a good life or whether you have a life at all. So I mean, I think economics is just as important.
How many? Okay, wait. If economic status impacts to lives, right? Then I have something to evaluate. So again, I'll ask you the same exact question. How many lives could we save by intervening in Iraq?
I can't quantify that for you, and you can't quantify for me how many people will die if
Yes,
we
I
intervene in
can.
ISIS.
And more than 4,500.
No, that's not true. Like,
Why is it not true?
I mean, first of all, like you can't quantify how many people are even being deployed to Iraq. The card that you read about 100,000 people going to Iraq actually comes off of the top of someone's head, like during an interview. It's not an empirical
come off the
analysis.
top,
It gives you no warrant, gives you no
In
analysis.
someone's
Can I actually ask a
analysis of
question
what is
now?
likely
Can I
to
ask a question
happen,
now?
when we consider the fact that like
Can I
the
please ask a
Islamic
question
State
now?
can raise 50,000, I'm trying to respond. When we consider the fact that they can raise 50, you just asked me a question, I want to answer your question. When we consider the fact that they can raise 50,000 soldiers at any time, right, and that they're the most advanced military force that we've ever faced on the ground, you're going to see that more people will probably die than they died last time against the weaker group.
Actually, this is really critical because Abi will read you a card in rebuttal that tells you if we intervene, 50,000 troops that have already been stationed but aren't being deployed because they don't think they have the strength necessary to fight the
Then there's still an
ISIL,
increased
will actually be
danger.
deployed. Wait, no, because this is a Sunni awakening. This is the Sunnis
Okay,
in the area
fine,
have
okay.
already mobilized a force. Can I actually ask a
What the
question?
CIA card says is likely that 100,000 U.S. troops will be used, and you can't say that like the Sunni, or that you can't necessarily like just fiat that the Sunni force would be enough to actually defeat ISIL, and in that case we still have 50,000 American troops, even if I would accept your evidence entirely.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to accept your evidence because it comes from an interview. It's
Doesn't
not
come
no
from an
analysis. No
interview.
warrant.
My
And
article
yet
that I
we see
gave you is not an interview. You saw the evidence and you saw that it was not an
Can I
interview.
ask you a question now?
Sure.
Okay, so logically, if I take away your property and then Abi restores that back to you, like why would you be mad at Abi?
I take away.
If I take away your property and then he gives it back to you, then why would you logically be more mad at him?
More mad at him.
Right.
Did he take the property from me?
No, he
Oh wait.
he restored
If
the
he
order-
restored
right.
property
He
from me.
restored ownership back to you.
Okay, well if I saw it as very clear and black and white as that, I might like Avi, right? But if the situation was a little bit more complicated, and perhaps we were talking about an active war zone, then it might get a little more confusing, right? And maybe I perceived that Avi was the one who took my property in the first place, maybe I might not like Avi at all.
Right, and that's why this situation is really different, right? For the first time, the United States is going to be
taking my
intervening.
property?
No, okay, the United States is going to be intervening on behalf of an Arab actor, not for its own self-interest.
All right.
Pro.
All right, we're taking.
What's her name?
Abhinav Jasmine.
Abby.
Abhi, yeah.
Is that not what you said?
No, that's Abhinav, my full name, yeah.
Abby now.
Yeah.
Okay.
I need to start prep right now.
Taking prep.
Rest in peace. We're going with her, by the way. You want this one? Oh, yeah. Alright, are my opponents ready? Partner? Yeah. Judges? Okay. So, let's begin this rebuttal with two observations. First, we should be weighing the round on lives for two reasons. One, lives are the largest magnitude impact in today's round. If you're not alive to like experience economic benefits. And two, because America has a primary duty to protect people's lives. That's what the social contract is. We agree to be part of the state in order for the state to protect us. The second observation is that my opponents have to show that solvency is long-term. And this is really important because of my second contention in which I talk about the root causes of these issues. We tell you that if the solvency is not long-term, then 5-10 years down the road, a very
ISIS-like group will come up again and have the same exact flaws that ISIS has right now and impart those flaws onto the Middle East. So let's go to their first contention, which they talk about oil. First, they talk about seizing oil fields. Then they talk about like slowing the supply of oil down and like decrease and like fear of hurting increasing price spikes. There are a couple of problems with this. The first is that there's absolutely no solvency for this argument. According to CNN, ISIS literally sets fire to oil fields that come under ground assault. That permanently destroys the utility of the oil in the area and means that our opponents don't gain anything by reclaiming the oil fields. Secondly, despite whatever effects ISIS has had on the oil market, and remember, their card says that this effect has already happened, the price of oil is at a historic low. An 11% increase in the price of oil, which is what they said happened, from $40 a barrel, which was the historic low, is a little more than $44 a barrel, which is still a pretty historic low. There's really no impact here because they just, like, nothing really happens to America. There's no weighability. Let's go to their second contention, in which they talk about like the spreadability of ISIS and then taking over water installations. So one, I'm just going to say there's no impact to U.S. interests here, aside from the increase in terrorism at the bottom of their case, and I'm going to attack that next. So next they talk about like targeting water installations. They don't tell you how many cities are directly like under siege from these attacks on water places. They don't tell you why this hasn't happened yet, despite ISIS being in control of the Mosul Dam for a better part of the year. They don't explain why that didn't happen. But lastly, right, the piece of evidence that links us to terrorism doesn't link a lack of water to terrorism. It links complete national destabilization to terrorism. That's a leap, step, and a hop from what they're advocating for, and it certainly is divorced from their link story. So let's go to their last contention, which is the solvency of this and where it kind of falls apart. So first they advocate for conventional forces, but if I can tell you that the status quo is better, you certainly negate. And according to CNN, again, within 2 years, the Iraqi army will sufficiently push ISIS out of Iraq. And insofar as that's true, all of their concerns are like dealt with, and we don't have to get our hands dirty and lose lives to ISIS. But second, and where they put most of their eggs in the basket, is the idea of the Sunni awakening. 3 reasons this doesn't happen. First is that it's probably not possible. When ISIS came through the Anbar province in northern Iraq, they purged and brutalized the leaders of the Sunni tribes that cooperated with the United States during the initial Sunni awakening. According to CNN, the most brutal treatment is often of tribes who cooperated with the United States against al-Qaeda in Iraq in the past years, mostly through the so-called Sunni awakening. So those tribes don't exist anymore. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to mount another invasion. But secondly, there's no willingness on the ground to cooperate, because according to the Council on Foreign Relations, it's painfully obvious that ISIS is aware of how the original Sunni awakening played out. And what they're doing is creating a system of brutalization in which they punish Sunni awakening leaders that even think about participating with Americans. They create an incentive structure that makes it impossible for another Sunni awakening to happen. But lastly, and most importantly, it just doesn't happen. Because according to Jen Rutengard, boots on the ground this time do the opposite of a Sunni awakening, because there's a strong perception in the Sunni community that military aid backs Iran-based Shia extremists that turns the link and inflames sectarian tensions. Let's go into the specific evidence that they talk about. So first, they talk about the Kagan evidence, which says that we can use troop conditionality to push reforms. But Al Jazeera says that in the status quo, troops are almost always unconditionally given, and there's no reason to expect that troop conditionality would ever happen. This is a plan, if anything, and at best, it's just not relevant. But lastly, they give the Biddle evidence, which talks about an increase in violence in Iraq, a decrease in violence in Iraq after the Sunni awakening, but ISIS came back. It wasn't a long-term solution, and the sands of time erased all gains. Thank you.
Here's the one question we have the response to Stuy and Jen Bergen. Everyone is ready?
Yeah.
Everyone is ready?
Straight down.
Okay, so first framework, then Thunder case. All right, let's begin. Starting off the observation, they tell you here, they tell you social contract is the most important way because lives are the most important. This is problematic because Michael Simon of Harvard finds that policymakers, U.S. policymakers, use utilitarianism as the way they weigh their policy actions. This is important because util subsumes all social contract obligations because essentially it evaluates all facets of the individual's life. At that point, if we impact the quality of life as well, that's still important. Don't disregard that today's round. And then I'm going to the first argument talking about troop deaths. Couple responses here, but the first two responses on face. First, Al-Qaeda is not ISIS, and this is really important for one reason. Sullivan tells you specifically that when you have ISIS as a state actor, you increase the chance of war termination by 17%. Al-Qaeda's hub and spokes is specifically different at that point and more decentralized in nature. At that point, we solve that for ISIS specifically, and all their requirements about the longer conflict, etc., are non-responsive there. Secondly, Maxwell at the time explains that he provides a counterexample of how many troops are necessary. He says only 13,000. At best, we gain offense. At worst, you recognize it's completely futile to try to assume how many troops will be on the ground. At that point, you don't buy the stat right there. Now it's a long conflict. Two responses here. First, John Bolton of Time magazine finds overall that the overall conflict could take only 6 months. At that point, no long-term impacts, not a long-term conflict overall. Secondly, Patrick Regan of Binghamton University finds overall, when there's a biased intervention on the side of the government, he finds overall reduction in conflict by 44%. At that point, there's no terminal impact to this long conflict card. Don't buy it right there. Now on to better conflict, more better fighters. Two responses here. First, recognize if we prove solvency, we still gain access back to stopping these better fighters. First, according to Christopher Paul of Rand, he finds in the past 100 years, 17 out of 18 all ground troop invasions that were counterinsurgency in nature were all successful. At that point, we prove empirical solvency. Secondly, Sankey Kim finds overall, when we invade in a biased manner, once again, we reduce the chance of rebel victory by 65.5%. Once again, proving solvency there, the just that better fighters is irrelevant. Now move on to the second argument, talking about this political problem. Now, before I move on to this, recognize our biggest response is going to be Sunni awakening. So I'm going to respond to their responses here. First, I'll tell you, the first response they give you are functionally irrelevant because they're all rhetorical in nature. They never give you the brink of impact. At what point do these two arguments actually mitigate the effectiveness of the Sunni awakening? They never tell you that warrants. The only part they give you is a third response, which essentially says, oh, you know, overall we already harmed. Sorry, Foreign Policy Magazine finds that this is problematic. But recognize one thing specifically, they dropped the Kimberly Kane card. This is crucial. When we provide leverage overall in the Iraqi government, we provide long-term stability and provide more inclusion in government. At that point, Sunni awakening still stands. With that in mind, two responses on face. First, Kagan, once again. At the point where the affirmative team turns back all their offense by providing leverage and allows for more Sunni inclusion, we solve in the long term. Secondly, turn it once again because of Iran hegemony. In the status quo, Shiite militias and Shiite government leaders have high ranking positions in the Iraqi military. At the point where U.S. intervention will actually delink them from the Iraqi government, we solve back to the problem of Shiite-dominated government. That's how we solve there. Now onto their idea of hydro effects. One response here: alternate causality. The reason why ISIS is so strong in the first place is not due to our failure in Iraq in the past, but according to Maxwell at the time, due to failed domestic policy. That's not our fault. That's alternate causality there. Now into alternate power sharing. First, turn this against them entirely because the alternate power sharing they reference about Shiite over Sunni occurs in the status quo. That means when we solve that for Iran hegemony, we solve that for that problem. To turn against them right there. Then finally, more on to the last argument about anti-American sentiment. A couple responses here. First, we're reshaping the narrative. John Keane uses how this problem explained. The reason why there's so much anti-American sentiment is it's always looked at the U.S. as stepping in for its own interests. At that point, he finds that when we intervene in ISIL and stop ISIL, we win the hearts and minds of Middle Eastern citizens by helping their own interests. At that point, we're changing the narrative. This has one significant impact: the Sunni awakening. At the point where it extends through, three impacts. First, 70% reduction in insurgent forces. Secondly, a reduction in overall violence. This is the violence isn't long term. The reason why the violence isn't long term was a failed domestic policy. Extend that impact right there. Then third and most importantly, long-term stability through leverage from Kagan. That's crucial. Then finally, they read one part in their presentation about Neumeyer. Two responses here. First is non-unique. He admits himself that preventing this type of aid would be implausible in the status quo or in the future. And moreover, his study only refers to terrorist groups that do not harm the government. At that point, it's not specific to this topic. Don't buy the study right there. That's why I strongly urge a negative ballot.
That's the second question. First question, take it. All right, you ready? Whenever you're ready. Okay. So, are we using conditional troops right now? It's like the status quo troop operations conditionality.
What do you mean by that?
Is the status quo how the United States issues military aid in the conditional form?
I would say yes.
Yes. So if using things like airstrikes and tactical deployments
Sure.
is conditional, why do we need troops to access your impacts from troop conditionality?
Specifically for leverage on the local Iraqi government.
You just said that
Right.
things like conditional airstrikes and conditional tac drops
Right.
are work in the same fashion. So it looks to
Sure.
me like we don't need troops to do that.
Wait, what are you responding to exactly here? You're saying conditionality. Why is that relevant?
Sure, Kagan.
Okay, so first, Kagan specifically finds that ground troop interventions are the single reason why Sunnis would trust the Iraqi government again. You said the leverage that they have in the area is crucial.
No, I understand that. I'm asking you whether or not leverage occurs in the status quo,
No.
so that I can analyze whether or not intervening with
because
boots on the
here's
ground is
the thing.
necessary in order
Sure.
to promote leverage.
Airstrikes are inherently dependent. They require ground forces to implement. However,
That's true.
wait, ground troops are independent, meaning that they can operate on their own, which applies
What
to
does
more
that have
leverage.
what does that have to
That
do
means
with
we have
conditionality?
that means we have more U.S. power on the ground to leverage government.
Oh, how much more
Otherwise,
power? How much more power?
specifically enough to get them to the Sunnis to join the Iraqi
Wait,
government.
so you have a piece of evidence that tells me that the difference of conditionality
Yes.
between airstrikes and boots on the ground is like a concession
Sure.
about
The
Sunnis?
Kagan specifically articulates that when you have ground troops on the ground, Sunnis will join the local Sunni troop division funded by the Iraqi government.
It doesn't say that reforms can be passed with
50,000
conditional
strong.
airstrikes.
Wait, it says, well, it didn't say, it admits that. But what it does say is, though,
Oh,
ground troops is the
okay.
only way you can do it.
Right.
That's, by admission, it's obviously proving otherwise, right? At the
All
point where
right,
ground troops
my
alone
partner
can
will
do it.
answer this in
Question
crossfire.
for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so you respond back to oil by saying essentially we don't incur the harm, right? The 11%, the status quo is not happening, right?
Oh no, I said like your impact is from when they took over Mosul. Right?
Sure, right.
All right, so that happened like a few months ago.
That's correct.
All right, so back then the price of oil was close to $40.
Right.
And I just wanted to put the weighing in the judge's perspective.
Right.
11% spike from $40
Sure.
is about $44.
Right.
So can I just ask a question quickly?
One sec. Let me explain.
Well, I'll answer your question.
I know, but I was going to explain. Just gonna
Well, I'm giving your partner will do that
Sure,
in
go
the next
ahead.
speech. So when was the last time we invaded a country and didn't tell them that it was in their best interests?
Not often, but the problem is it's pretty damn obvious,
No.
right? At the point where specifically, right, like when we invaded like Iraq in the Second Gulf War, it's like, oh, we're here for WMDs. It's pretty obvious that we're in it for national security interests.
So
point
wait, so this
here.
time we're not in it for our
The
national
distinction here is
security
this: our interests and their interests coincide. That's what links in us to our impacts.
Look, all I'm saying is like
Wait, no,
this
that's what I'm saying,
changes-
right?
No,
The coincidence of the the
Your
choice.
link is the changing of the narrative. The
Right.
narrative seems to be the exact same thing. And
But-
I just want to
wait,
but this is
sure,
how we
sure.
differentiate, right? We differentiate the two worlds by whether or not people on the ground believe you or believe me.
And we studied
Muqtada
that they do from
al-Sadr-
Kagan, right?
and
We studied them from Kagan.
No,
That's
you
that's
tell
the
me,
only
no, you
fair.
tell me that you can force change through Kagan.
Right.
What Muqtada al-Sadr, the third
Wait.
most influential mullah in
One
Iraq, said is that if Americans
Wait,
put
wait.
boots on the ground, my force of
Wait, wait.
50,000 men will
And
attack
according
them.
to Kagan, also
There will
argues
be
Sunnis will
backlash.
join the Iraqi government. That's linked there.
We'll take that. Well, actually, we pause that. And that's the key piece of evidence where you say
Yeah. Here you go.
Sorry, bro. Can I see the source? Yeah, that's not in the lower document.
Sure, I mean, she was the exact same thing to us like 2 minutes ago, but okay.
Okay, where is this, the yellow part?
Highlight part, yeah.
Okay, starting prep. Thanks, yeah, pause for a moment. Yeah. Yeah, all right. Okay, we don't have prep time. My phone's ready. Partner ready. Good, just all ready.
As a basic framing mechanism, we give you the fact that the United States lives are the most important interest to United States citizens, or to the U.S. interest, right? Because you can't take it back a life, and life is a prerequisite to enjoying any of these monetary concerns that they try to stress in their case. With that in mind, look to their case and the fact that they're trying to solve for this issue of terrorism, right? But they never give you a long-term solution to the problem. The only time they try to do that is this part of the contention about Sunni awakening, but we respond to it very clearly. Jacob says that there's a strong perception that the U.S. supports the Shia interest, not the Sunni interest, so they're not going to actually side with us. And then also, ISIS is eliminating the leaders. We actually have no one on the ground we can trust. We can't start the Sunni awakening again. This is critical because without a long-term solution, what Vox finds in our second contention is that ISIL will only be replaced with a more dangerous and brutal opposition, because there are other Sunni groups that are disaffected that will rise up, and those groups have deeper connections with the local population and would lead a worse opposition to this group. They have no solvency. But also, we have two additional offensive voting issues. And the first one is going to be this argument of troop deaths. He makes two responses. The first one is that intervention could only last 6 months. That article says if Britain and America intervene together, it would only take 6 months. But Britain isn't going to intervene, so this isn't relevant. Then he says it would only require 13,000 troops. But even if it's a tenth of what we suggest, right, and only 13,000 or 10,000, right, even if it's only a tenth of the deaths that was before, and instead of 4,500, it's 450, that still isn't justified, right? Because all of Islamic extremism only killed 2 people a year, according to UNC, right? It would take 200 years for you to even begin to recoup the loss of life that you would have by affirming. You're signing a death warrant for 450 people, they better show you that's justified. But the last voting issue in today's round is this issue of anti-American terrorism, right? And this is critical because even if terrorism is decreasing, the share of anti-American terrorism can be increasing at the same time, and that means overall we're losing more American lives to terrorism. And that's our whole third contention. The idea that us acting in opposition of these terror groups means that we're incentivized to attack the United States homelands to get us out of the region. They make no response to the logical warrant in this contention at all. All they try to do is indict Newmeyer by saying it's not like accounting for certain terrorist groups. It is that you can call for the evidence, but also the warrant is enough to let it stand, and you see there's a 30% increase in anti-American terrorism.
And judges? Alright, let's start off with one main observation, which they completely dropped that's told to you by Levy in his rebuttal. He tells you that we should be weighing this round on a utilitarian framework. They don't respond to it. This is for the reason that policymakers, when they look at these actions, do evaluate it on a utilitarian framework. First, we look at quality of lives, and we look at lives. At that point, let's look at this 6 months defeat. We tell you that this can happen in 6 months because further according to Kagan, the U.S. leadership can bring together a 60-nation coalition that can fight against ISIS. At that point, you're going to be saying that a 6-month defeat is definitely possible, and that's what we're going to be advocating in today's round. At that point, let's move to the first voting issue, which is on the U.S. interest. First, on oil. They tell you that ISIL sets fire to these oil fields, but this doesn't happen in every instance. It actually only happened in 2. At that point, when they tell you that oil prices were historic low, this is completely irrelevant for a few reasons. First, perception is very critical. It doesn't matter how low oil prices are. If these oil price spikes are happening, that's leading to our impact that we tell you about recession. But further, even if these oil prices are very low, when you look at Mosul, it actually increased oil prices by $15. I wouldn't say that that's insignificant. At that point, you extend through our 2 impacts. First, Ayman, who tells you that a moderate oil shock increases the probability of recession by 60%. Second, according to Johnson, a moderate disruption of 1 million barrels shaves off 1% of US GDP. We're linking back to quality of life. Then second, on regional instability. They're unresponsive to Piazza, who tells you that failed states harbor 10 to 15 times more terrorism. At that point, the only way to solve that for long-term terrorism is to remove these failed states. At that point, you look at Kim, who tells you that over 30 years, empirical study shows you that ground interventions are overwhelmingly successful at eliminating failed states and restoring the order back to these countries. Then third and finally, on solvency. First, they don't respond to our warrant specifically about how ISIL is actually conventional military that makes it easier to fight them effectively. At that point, you extend through our Sullivan card that tells you there's a 17% increase in effectiveness for ground troops. But second, on Sunni awakening, they tell you it's not happening. We specifically tell you that there are 50,000 troops that are literally ready to be deployed if the United States just committed. They don't respond to this. This comes from you through rebuttal. Then finally we tell you that we're pushing out the Shiite opposition. At that point we're solving back for their harms. Then finally we tell you that we're reshaping the narrative in the Middle East. This isn't like previous interventions because we're finally intervening on behalf of Arab actors. For all these reasons we urge an affirmative ballot.
Okay. So you guys ready for crossfire?
Yep.
So everyone's ready? Yeah. How many dollars will committing combat ground troops save?
That's not our burden. I'm going to bring it up now.
That's not your burden. That's how you weigh your impact.
I mean,
Actually, no, our impacts are specific.
it doesn't matter. I mean, if the U.S. economy is going to collapse, that like affects
Wait,
everything. It
wait,
doesn't
wait,
matter
wait,
how
wait.
much like dollar value.
No,
I'm sure.
that's not
Fine.
what you tell me.
No,
You don't tell me the
here.
U.S.
You
economy.
don't tell me the United States economy
If
is
you'd like me to
collapsing.
answer, I'd answer. Right, so here. Mark Gilbert of Harvard University finds that it was a multiplier effect of 1.5% for every 1% we put in.
When was that study published?
That was published 2014.
2014.
Yeah, last year.
I
What
mean,
does that
defense
mean?
spending
What did you
spurs
say?
more research, spend more.
Right.
they
So
put
for
more
every 1% we
into
put in, we get 1.5% out overall in overall
1%,
economic growth.
1% of what we put in.
Military
Defense spending.
expenditure.
Wait. We don't necessarily increase our military budget when we fight ISIS. We
Right.
already have the
This has
largest
nothing to do
military.
with ISIS,
Wait,
fighting
wait,
ISIS
wait,
at all.
wait.
It's about a military budget.
Right, here's the thing. When you invest in the when you buy goods, right, you put them into the market, and the market increases demand, aggregate demand shifts
No,
to
no,
the
no.
right, and
No,
overall the
wait,
GDP
wait,
increases. It's pretty
still
simple.
have the
right?
same
multiplier
Department
effect
of
is
Defense
still
budget.
there.
Yeah, wait, please. The
What?
Department of Defense budget is earmarked at the beginning of the year
By Congress.
Yeah, they spend that
Every
money.
year.
It
Yeah.
doesn't
Wait.
matter. You ask us how
Actually-
much it's going to cost the economy. We're going to tell you that there's a net return on investment. If you're going to
That's
make
right.
the cost
No,
argument,
no.
attacking ISIL doesn't change the amount of money that's getting invested in the Department of Defense.
Kevin
It does not
Johnson,
change the amount of money that
Kevin
comes back
Johnson
out.
finds in 2006 there was a $24 billion slack in the military budget. At that point, when we do invade ISIS, we increase that. We
suddenly-
use all the budget.
Wait. Can you give
Why?
me evidence that says
Why?
that when we invade ISIS, we
No.
compensate for the
I'm
last
not-
slash
here,
in budget?
I'm not saying we'll spend that exact amount of money. I'm saying we'll increase our
Are we
expenditures.
no longer in a financial recession because we're fighting ISIS?
Wait, that's not our
That's where
impact.
budget cuts happen.
Wait.
That's not our impact.
Wait,
We
but
have
also-
to think it's going to cost the U.S. economy. We're saying it's not going to cost the U.S. economy. We're not trying
Right.
to make it a point.
No, but your point doesn't
So
make
what is
sense,
your
right?
impact?
Because even with
Wait.
the 24 billion, wait, if I'm doing my math right, and I think that I am, right? Even with a $24 billion cut,
24 million. It's 24 million.
The U.S. Department of Defense still vastly outspends literally every other defense department on the globe.
Wait.
I really don't see why we would be
Wait,
infusing them with more cash.
There's two ways that we supply the U.S. economy. First is through oil, preventing a recession.
Well, oil.
which is-
Let's talk about
wait,
oil.
Wait,
Let's talk about
one
oil.
second. The second way is through the multiplier effect. When we
Yeah.
increase expenditures, we increase the overall economic growth. That's
Let's
really
focus
simple.
on oil then, right? How
Sure.
much money are we saving the economy? How much
We're
less likely
preventing a
to
recession.
How?
No, that's not
Wait,
what
by solving
Well,
back
evidence
failed
never
states.
said ISIL is
saying,
going-
wait, we give you the card for saying team, which finds that we solve that for failed states. We
Oh.
solve that for failed states. We solve that for the problem of oil.
Okay, so without failed states, without
without
failed states, there's no oil impact.
No, we're telling you that ISIS currently offers oil for finance, and if we invade, we have the ability to take them back. That's the key link there.
Right. We tell you
What
that
happens when they
attack oil
burn the
fields,
oil
it's fine.
refineries before we come in there?
That's-
That's only happened in two instances.
Well,
Exactly.
Out of
We
how
don't have-
many? Wait, out of how many?
Two out of dozens at least. I mean,
Wait,
we
wait,
can
what?
card
Wait, I'm pretty
we
sure
can
that's
bring you
not
a
true.
card if you
I
like,
remember-
right?
Wait,
That's
I
the
mean, like
problem.
just off the top of my head, there's the Anorak refinery and the Ravani
Right.
refinery. I don't know of any other
What do
refineries.
you mean dozens of refineries?
Sure. I mean, but here's the thing, right?
How many refineries are there in Iraq?
They took about 90%
More than
of all of Iraq's
And they seized
serious
all of
oil
dozens?
refineries. And then we tell you, wait, we tell you at the top, they took an oil refinery that was the cause of 17% of Iraq's oil. Like, that's pretty.
Box salt. Box salt.
Hey, guys, okay. Alright, ready? Corners?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's start with framework. We say U.S. lives, they say utilitarian. That's fine. At the end of the day, the synthesis here is that lives vastly outweigh economics for the reasons I gave because of irreversibility and magnitude on a simple utilitarian calculus. Like that should be pretty easy. Now, here's the idea of like the long term, right? And this is framing. So they say that like the Sunni awakening is going to happen. We say the perception is, maybe it's not the reality on the ground, but the perception is that U.S. money, guns, and people go to help Shia-based opposition groups, which fuels sectarian tensions. Then they say that we can defeat ISIS quickly, but remember, we toppled Saddam Hussein in 6 months, but we stayed for 10 years. Maybe we topple ISIS quickly, but the deeper regional problems never go away. This is really important, and here's where we win the round. Vox, which they never respond to, not in rebuttal, not in summary, and don't let them do it in final focus, which we tell you that if they don't provide a long-term solution to the problem, then 5 or 10 years down the road, another group almost identical to ISIL comes back through the woodwork. And this group is stronger because it's more nationalist, it's more connected to the Sunni power base, and now the kicker kicker is that they're anti-American because we've invaded their country again. ISIS currently isn't attacking America, but this group will 30% more, according to Neumeier, extended by my partner in summary. Don't let them respond to it. We make the security situation worse in the long term, and that should be well worth signing your ballot for the negation. But let's go into the cost-benefit analysis. On their side, they have oil. We tell you that they burn oil fields, and they don't give any impact analysis about this. Even if you give them their impact, it's still only a $4 increase in price. At the end of the day, they don't tell you how much money is either helped or hurt in the United States economy because of ISIS, but we tell you something. We tell you that very simply on the cost-benefit analysis is troop deaths. It's the simplest story being told. When we go to war, people die at a minimum 450 versus the 2 lives per year that terrorism takes. I can see no possible world in which that is a favorable cost-benefit analysis for the affirmation. Remember, lives are categorically more important than economic gains because 1, I'm quantifying it. They don't quantify until the final focus. 2, it's irreversible. You can't get a life back. And 3, that's what America's here to do. Thank you.
Everyone's ready?
Yeah.
Judges ready? Partner ready? Two observations and two voters. Alright. First on util. They can see util and essentially in their focus, but it's crucial here for one reason. At the point where we impact the entire U.S. population through recession, that impact, the magnitude of the impact, far outweighs the small the impact to the college troops that get killed, unfortunately, when we invade. At that point, you outweigh magnitude there. But not the time frame. They frame it as if in the long term we're going to fail overall. But they missed the most important card, and we're really not on this card. The Canadian card is completely dropped throughout every single speech in the debate. This is crucial. At the point where we increase leverage in local government, when we have uniquely drawn troops to further it, we prevent Sunni exclusion, and we preserve long-term stability and more political inclusion. At that point, we're solving back for the long-term problem. And remember, we said specifically, the reason why ISIL came up in the first place was due to domestic policy failure. We solve that for that problem. We don't sponsor an rebel either. We solve that problem. We don't have another ISIL. That's crucial there. Then on top of that, the 6 months card also is important because at that point, you're minimizing troop casualties overall. At that point, remember, the big 4,500 card comes to you from Iraq, not from the current situation. Make them show you specific evidence to ISIL right now. Now to interest. First on to oil. Remember here specifically, we show you the overall market confidence is what's a key here, not just price increases. So if market confidence gets shattered, we see transfer percentage going up by 60% for the entire American public, outweigh that on magnitude and scope for the entire American population, not just for a few troop lives. That's crucial there. Then they dropped one other big card, Piazza. 15 times fold increase in terrorism back to the U.S. That directly impacts lives to U.S. terrorism on U.S. shores. That's crucial there. And remember, we solved that for that problem through Kim, who finds the eliminate terrorism. We solved for failed states. We solved that for Piazza impacts. That's the reason why you give a pro right there. Outweigh the small troop deaths. Now to solvency. The student awakening. Essentially, remember, the Canadian card is the most important card here. We increase overall enrollment into the army and the 50,000 troop coalition. At that point, we get term tax. 70% reduction, 255 in troops, 250% reduction in overall violence, and then Kagan long-term stability. And then secondly, Iran hedge goes clean dropped here. At the point where we prevent Shiite militias from getting dominating government, we preserve long-term stability. And finally, last but not least, the Sullivan card. This is crucial. So the Sullivan card essentially provides you to solve for a state action status quo. We change the narrative and we solve for the problem. Thank you.